Which brings us to the difference between plot and story. Plot is what happens and the order in which it happens. The queen died, and then the king died. That's plot. Story is the emotional and personalities surrounding the plot. The queen died by being poisoned, and then the king died from a broken heart. That's story. And Scorsese prefers story over plot, or often instead of plot. Scorsese's film might be the king dies slowly from a broken heart because why? What do you mean he can't find the queen? She's probably in somebody's trunk, dead. What? How do I know? I didn't do it. I haven't seen the queen since like Tuesday. For all I know, she might have gone to Vegas. Nevertheless, many sports movies and crime movies have similar shapes, which makes sense because their stories play off simple dichotomies, good and bad, strong and weak, and so forth. And their themes typically play off of these dichotomies. Similarly, the war and horror genres also share their own general story shape, which reinforces the common themes found in each of these genres. These kinds of movies, these genres, horror, war, are more often about groups, a group of soldiers on a mission, a group of teenagers alone in the woods. And those groups thematically stand in for society. A group of soldiers representing the fortitude of the United States, for instance, in a movie like Black Hawk Down or in Platoon. An array of characters with different backgrounds and different beliefs. Smart ones, strong ones, loners, family-oriented, lifers, newbies, the whole lot. They represent us as a nation. Just as the isolated individuals in a horror movie can also represent the collective ills of society. Because horror movies are cautionary tales, cautioning us as a society against our darker sides. And so these characters are lustful or uncaring, they're vain, deceitful, shallow, and most of all, they're typically rule breakers. And those are the ones who die. That's how the pattern is created, typically. Let's start with horror films. Typically, there's a group of characters. They, the group. The group is the protagonist, and the antagonist is the killer. And this group, one by one, gets whittled down. The killer kills them, one by one, sometimes two at a time, but one by one until there is only one left to stand up and do battle at the end. So as a shape, I kind of look at it as a series of lines running horizontally across the page. One line for each character. So if it starts as a group of 8, there would be 8 parallel lines, all starting off together. The group at the beginning of the film. But one by one by one, each of those lines stops short when the character is killed. The others keep going until there's only one left at the end to face the killer one-on-one. And thematically, that lone survivor is the one who is most pure, because remember, horror movies are secretly morality tales where the pure at heart survives and the rest don't. Now, war movies have a similar shape, but an entirely different theme. In war movies, it's not a morality tale. It's a coin toss. Anybody can die at any time. The enemy doesn't discriminate like a horror villain does. But still, in a war movie, the characters die 1 or 2 at a time. Also getting whittled away, the group whittled away until there are only a few, sometimes just one, left standing at the end. And it's that surviving character that carries the theme. Sometimes it's a story about redemption, and those that clear their debt are the ones who live. Or sometimes it's a story about the randomness of war, and survival is random. Sometimes the brave survive, sometimes the clever, the mad, the innocent. I mean, you get the idea. And the idea that the shape of the story, the rhythm in this case of who lives and who dies, that rhythm affects the outcome and therefore affects the theme of the movie. So personally, when I write a screenplay, I like to do a little back of the napkin diagram of what the story is going to look like. Because, for instance, if I'm writing a war movie, I'm going to want to know who's going to die in the first act. And then I'm going to want to know who dies in the second act and who's going to be around for the climax at the end of the film. Now, not everyone writes like that, I know. I know some people, they like to write off the top of their head. And they like to let the story kind of come to them naturally, organically. And that's fine. I mean, to each his own. But to those people, those screenwriters, I would say one thing. Revisit your story in the rewriting process and then think about your story shape. Because the shape matters. Thinking back on this war movie idea, how can I write it thematically? How can I craft my story? How can I craft my metaphors and my character arcs? How can I do that if I don't even know who's going to die in the battle? I mean, I guess I learned to write this way back when my first professional writing job. I was hired by Peter Falk. To write a Columbo murder mystery, a made-for-TV movie. And the way it works is that you pitch your ideas to the producer, who at this time was Rob Levine. And then you pitch the idea to Peter if Rob thinks it has potential. Well, before I came in to pitch, Rod gave me a Bible of episodes. By this point, it was the late 90s, and they'd been making Columbo movies for almost 30 years. Rob gives me this book with 2-page summaries of every episode ever made. It was more than 50 episodes, and he says to me, "You can pitch any ideas except for these." And so over the next few weeks, as I started to read through these stories, I began to realize that they all had the same pattern. They all had the same shape. The murder, and then Columbo. Then the murderer trying to escape detection. And then Columbo trying to figure out the crime. It's that V-shaped story I was talking about, with Columbo closing in to the very end of the episode and eventually solving the crime. And once I knew that, once I had figured out the code, fitting my ideas into that rhythm was so much easier. That was my first professional screenplay sale and the project that got me into the Writers Guild. The story was called Columbo and the Curse of Sorcery Circus. Unfortunately, Mr. Falk retired before they could make it. His last episode as Columbo was Columbo Likes the Nightlife, released in 2003 when Peter was just 76 years old. Ever since, I've always looked for patterns that can help me tell my stories. I figured it was something that everyone did. Then when I started teaching, I taught this approach as part of my process, but quickly found out that very few screenwriting instructors or authors discuss this idea at all. It's one of those ideas that's so simple that you can understand why no one has written about it. And at the same time, it's so important to understand that for me, it's hard to believe that more people haven't written about it. I finally found one person who does. A really great book. It's called Good Scripts, Bad Scripts by Tom Pope. So if you're interested in learning more about how filmmakers give elegant shapes to their stories, I highly recommend it. This was the book that helped me to better understand the complexities of different story shapes. And this isn't to say that all of the movies in these genres have to use these specific story shapes. In fact, not all of them do, but the great ones, they certainly start with these shapes in mind and then make adjustments based on the themes and the characters in their stories. For instance, remember how I said that Casablanca uses the romance story shape? Well, it does. And it doesn't. What I mean is, when you watch the movie, Rick is alone for a good part of the beginning of the story. And then Ilsa arrives. She's already committed to her guy Laszlo. Of course, there's still some back and forth between the two over the letters, but most of what we see is in flashback, broken up with a handful of scenes filled with remorse and piano music. But if you look and take a look at the story outside of the way it was assembled on the screen, you'll see something very different. If the story was told in a linear fashion, the story starts off when Rick and Ilsa are meeting in Paris. Then they're torn apart by Laszlo's return and the war itself. Then they get back together later in Casablanca. only to be torn apart again by the fact that there's only 2 letters of transit left. Then the opportunity to be back together again at the end when Laszlo is arrested. So the story itself follows the shape of a romance, but the filmmakers decided to take the beginning, the story in Paris, and move it to the middle and tell it in flashback. They did this for dramatic effect, creating more tension. Tension as we are dying to know what happened that could have broken Rick's heart so severely.